Dear ladies and gentlemen, today we are holding the 9th table in this format. We appreciate the interest of the world majority in your person in the efforts that are being made in connection with the Ukrainian crisis. We try to communicate our position, actions and plans to our friends as openly and concretely as possible. This time, I would like to look at what is happening, its history, and what is happening now through the prism of the UN Charter, ratified by all the states represented here, which enshrines universal principles designed to regulate interstate communication. These principles include the sovereign equality of states, the rejection of the use of force and the threat of force, and respect for human rights without distinction between race, gender, language, or religion. All member states have signed up to them. But our colleagues in the West, for a better understanding of the geopolitical situation, we will call them the Western minority, ignore the principles of the organization's charter. For example, the West has never taken into account the sovereign equality of states. In retrospect, remember what international crises have been since the creation of the United Nations. In none of these situations did the West respect the principle of sovereign equality of states, considering itself superior to others. Hence the expression golden billion and the famous phrase of the former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy J. Borrell says that Europe is a Garden of Eden surrounded by a jungle. That is, all of us, from the same place, from this mentality. The famous expression of former Secretary of State E. Blinken that those who do not get a place at the democratic table will be on the menu. This is the philosophy regarding the sovereign equality of states. If the West refers to certain principles to justify its actions, it does so selectively, choosing only those principles that are beneficial to it in this particular situation, depending on its actions. In the case of Kosovo, they said that they were implementing the principle of self-determination of peoples without any referendum, unilaterally declaring independence. In other cases, as was the case with Crimea, when more than 95% of residents openly and transparently voted for reunification with Russia, the West declared that in this case, it would not recognize the nation's right to self-determination and demanded respect for the principle of territorial integrity. We are well aware of these double standards. The nationalists, who came to power in Kiev in February 2014, a result of an armed unconstitutional coup, ended up there as a result of a violation of another principle of the UN Charter, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. The fact that the coup was organized by the United States was not even concealed by such figures of the previous administration as former Deputy Secretary of State V. Newland. At a Senate hearing, she proudly stated that it was not for nothing that the United States spent $5 billion to change power in Ukraine. The fact that it was, in fact, the day after the signing of the agreement between the opposition and then President Viktor Yanukovych, did not bother anyone. The European Union, as they say, simply cut off all its guarantees that were put under this agreement. As a result, the nationalists, having overthrown the legitimate government, unleashed a real bloodbath against residents of Crimea and southeastern Ukraine who disagree with their policies, using the army, including artillery and combat aircraft, against civilian targets and civilians. The military actions, which lasted almost a year, were stopped by signing the Minsk package of measures, which was unanimously approved by a Security Council resolution. But as we now know very well, and as the leaders of Germany and France of that time admitted, no one in the West or in Kiev was going to fulfill these Minsk agreements. They immediately set out to sabotage this document, admitting that they only wanted to buy time to increase the military potential of the Kiev regime. The principle of the UN Charter, contained in its Article 25, prescribes all member states to comply with the decisions of the UN Security Council, has also been trampled. The West once again ignored him, as it ignores this principle in relation to many other UN Security Council resolutions, including resolutions on the need to establish a Palestinian state. In March 2014, residents of Crimea, and in September 2022, residents of Donetsk, Lugansk People's Republics, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions exercised their right to self-determination, enshrined in Article 1 of the UN Charter, during referendums. We, the Russian Federation, recognize them and, in the face of the continued aggression of the Nazi Kiev regime, with the support of the West, stood up for them in full accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, which presupposes the right of states to individual or collective self-defense. But the West did not want to pay attention to these articles of the Charter and directly insisted that Russia had violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and therefore it needed to be restored. At the same time, the interpretation of the UN Charter is deliberately ignored. After all, years of negotiations were devoted to this. This process ended in 1970 with the unanimous adoption by the General Assembly of the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation between states, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. When talking about territorial integrity, it is important to keep in mind the unified consolidated opinion of the international community, which no one has ever questioned in discussions. This document, the 1970 Declaration, confirms the inviolability of territorial integrity and political unity, but only of those states that respect the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and which have governments representing, without distinction of race, religion or skin color, all the people living in the relevant territory. It is obvious that the Kiev regime, which sent friendship trains with armed militants to Crimea, then bombed Donbas, burned people alive in Odessa, and carried out ethnic cleansing, could not, and even then could not represent the population of the lands in question. Ukrainian figures of that time publicly called people living in Crimea and Donbas inhumans and declared that their children would rot in basements while Ukrainian children flourished. This was said by the then President of Ukraine, P.A. Poroshenko, in early September 2021, long before the special military operation. V.A. Zelensky himself, during an interview, when asked by a correspondent what he thought of people who refused to recognize the coup and who were obliged to grant autonomous status under the Minsk agreements, said that there are people, but there are creatures. In another interview, he added that if someone lives in Ukraine and considers himself involved in Russian culture and language, then for the sake of the future of his children and grandchildren, let them leave for the territory of Russia. How can such a regime, whose leader says such things, represent the population he is talking about, claiming that this is the territory of Ukraine? This is a gross violation of the 1970 Declaration and should be perceived as such, not to mention the fact that the Russian language is legally prohibited in Ukraine in the fields of education, media, culture, and everyday communication. If you come to a store in Ukraine and speak Russian, you may be refused service or even handed over to the police. A law has recently been passed that prohibits the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. As I said at the beginning of my speech, the UN Charter requires respect for human rights without distinction between race, gender, language, or religion. Russian is the only language in the world, and Ukraine is the only country that has banned a foreign language. There is no other language that is legally prohibited in any country. Hebrew is not prohibited in the Palestinian territories or other Arab countries. Arabic is not banned in Israel, and Russian is banned in Ukraine. Draw conclusions about how this relates to the requirements to comply with the UN Charter. Another principle of the UN Charter is enshrined in its Article 100, according to which the staff of the Secretariat must adhere to the principles of impartiality, equidistance, objectivity, and act in the interests of all member states. Unfortunately, in recent years, we have witnessed gross violations of the principle of impartiality. The leadership of the Secretariat and many staff representing Western countries are associated with the anti-Russian line and refer to the resolutions of the UN General Assembly, which were adopted at the emergency special session on Ukraine. There are already 8 such resolutions. From a third to a quarter of the member countries did not vote for them, and the UN Secretary General A. Guterres believes that these resolutions exist, and he will implement them. When I asked him the declarations I mentioned, which require respect for the principle of self-determination of peoples, were among the resolutions that the UN Secretary General must implement, he evaded the answer and, like his official representative, continues to demand or advocate a settlement of the Ukrainian crisis based on international law, the UN Charter, and the principle of territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is a failure by the chief employee of the Secretariat to comply with the requirements of the Charter. The general tone is set in an anti-Russian way. At the end of August, Guterres condemned the Russian attack on Ukrainian cities. Every time Ukraine and its European masters start throwing tantrums, accusing Russia of destroying civilian targets and civilians, we see how the Secretariat supports such statements and demands that Russia be punished together with the West and Ukraine. The Russian army never strikes civilian targets or civilians. For every accusation, we ask the question, where's the evidence? Show us the facts about the fakes accusing the Russian army of crimes that later turned out to be committed by the Ukrainian regime. There are numerous facts. We have a special video that we will definitely show you on occasion. Violations of international humanitarian law by the Kiev regime, though obvious, that they simply cannot be denied. There are plenty of facts. However, the Secretariat takes the opposite line and tries to whitewash the actions of the Kiev regime. Although they violate such key requirements of international humanitarian law, as the prohibition to deploy military equipment and firing positions in residential areas, torture, and abuse of prisoners of war and civilians. When individual gross violations of international humanitarian law can no longer be denied, the UN Secretariat shyly makes impersonal appeals for restraint. Addressing these appeals to both sides, we observed a similar reaction when it was obvious to everyone how inhumanly the Nazi formations of the Kiev regime were acting when they invaded the Kursk region, where there were no military facilities at all. They deliberately targeted shops, schools, and other civilian facilities. Civilians were killed and captured. The fact that the UN is protecting the Kiev regime in every possible way has been repeatedly confirmed, including with regard to the situation that occurred in April 2022 in the locality of Bucha. 3 years have passed since the Kiev regime and its Western curators concocted a story about the alleged mass murder of local residents by Russian military personnel. They have announced new sanctions against our country. I have repeatedly addressed Guterres. We have written an official letter and addressed our requests to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Turk, asking for help in obtaining information on how the investigation of the episode, from which the West made a tragedy in April 2022, is progressing. The last time was in September 2024. It was only in July of this year that we received a response. He had been responding for almost a year, containing very interesting information. According to the response, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights analyzed our request and concluded that the relevant information could not be disclosed, as it would violate confidentiality obligations to third parties and could jeopardize the security of an activities. If you understood something in this answer, then I envy you. It is clear that the Secretariat in no way wants to expose those who are staging bloody dramatizations. As for Guterres, I've been asking him one question for the 3rd year in a row. You may not be able to access the investigation, but could you, Mr. Secretary General, be asked to use your authority to get a list of people whose corpses were shown on the central street in Bucha? Moreover, they were shown by a group of BBC correspondents who unexpectedly appeared there. I addressed Guterres both personally and publicly at meetings of the UN Security Council. He shyly averts his eyes. I think this is a disgrace for the Secretary General and for the entire Secretariat. The other day, just yesterday, Mr. Guterres made another statement. He said he was not optimistic about the rapid progress in the peace process in Ukraine. They say an immediate ceasefire is needed, but one that would lead to a solution based on the UN Charter, international law and UN General Assembly resolutions. I have already told you about the resolutions of the UN General Assembly and the principles of the UN Charter that Mr. Guterres ignores, believing that of all these principles, only one must be fulfilled: respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That is, and the Europeans support him in this, to withdraw Russian troops from those lands whose population voted against preserving their territories as part of the Nazi regime. We're not talking about territories. We are talking about the fates of those people whose ancestors have been developing these lands for centuries, building cities, ports, factories, and railways, whom the regime that came through the coup has now called inhumans. Guterres said that after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia rejects the very idea of a truce, defending the need for a global agreement, that is, a final settlement. For him, therefore, it turns out that it all started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and before that, in 2014, there was a coup d'etat. There was a war unleashed by the regime against its own people. There were the Minsk agreements, the purpose of which was to end this war, which in turn was not done by the Kiev regime, and which also demanded that a special status be granted within Ukraine for part of the territories of the southeast of this country. All this was approved by the UN Security Council. Then no one did it for 7 years, and when, in February 2022, Russia repeatedly tried to negotiate an end to the sabotage of the Minsk agreements, an end to the Kiev regime's war against its own people, and mutual security obligations that would suit both Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. When all these attempts were rejected, we had to respond to the request of new ones, republics that declared independence in a referendum. It was only then that Mr. Guterres noticed that something was happening in Ukraine, calling everything I described in one term the Russian invasion of Ukraine. By the way, he said that Russia rejects the truce and insists on a global agreement. Of course, we have already had a truce and a settlement agreement, in particular, to establish a government of national unity in 2014 and hold elections. So much for the settlement. They signed up for it anyway. Germany and France guaranteed this agreement. Their signatures were ignored, and they gladly swallowed it. Then there were the Minsk agreements. There was also a truce and a global settlement, and all the same, they were trampled on with this truce and the principle of global settlement. Guterres is subject to the Western habit of undoing history. The West likes to refer to history to justify its actions. However, only from the moment when it meets its interests. There was no coup in Ukraine. Russia simply took and recognized Crimea as its territory in response to the request of the population. There are many examples of this kind. Therefore, we are sad to see how the leadership of the UN Secretariat is increasingly closing in with the Western anti-Russian front, thereby damaging the credibility of the organization itself. We see the reason for this in the fact that over the past many years, the West has sought, and not unsuccessfully, in fact, to privatize key positions in the UN Secretariat. Currently, there are 5 or 6 senior officials, including the Secretary General and his deputies, who are really responsible for political issues in the context of conflict resolution, peacekeeping operations, humanitarian issues, security issues, and the preparation of proposals for reform in connection with its 80th anniversary. All these key posts are occupied by NATO member countries. The first Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations is a worthy woman. She is a representative of Nigeria, but at the same time holds a citizenship. Draw conclusions. We will do everything possible to stop this practice, as a result of which the West has crushed all the levers of management of the UN Secretariat. We will strive to ensure that everyone returns to using the World Organization's platform to find reasonable compromises and balance the interests of all members of the world community. Recently, efforts to promote a settlement of the Ukrainian crisis have intensified. We welcome the efforts of our partners, including the countries of the Global South and East, China and Brazil, as well as the participants of the Group of Friends of Peace in Ukraine created by Beijing and Brasilia. We also welcome the initiatives that a group of African countries, led by South Africa, took at one time. There are a number of other requests. I can't list them all. In particular, at the beginning of the conflict, the Arab League showed interest. We also see that the new administration in Washington also understands the need to resolve the crisis by recognizing its root causes, as well as by taking actions to eliminate these root causes. On August 15th, the presidents of Russia and the United States met in Alaska. There was a clear understanding by the American administration of the need to eliminate these root causes. President Donald Trump, the only one of the Western and other leaders, has publicly said this. Ukraine's involvement in NATO was a mistake, which served as one of the reasons for this conflict. Americans also understand that people who, in protest against the oppressive Nazi regime, spoke out in referendums on joining and returning to the Russian Federation, will never live under the yoke of the current Kiev authorities. This understanding is also reflected in the initiatives promoted by the Trump administration. Its representatives have repeatedly made public statements on this matter. Once again, I want to say that we are not talking about territories. The West likes to say, these are the territorial concessions that Russia wants for itself. This is not going to happen. These are not territories, not lands. These are the fates of people whom the regime in Kiev and its Western masters do not consider to be human beings. They want to destroy them in every possible way, including legally. I have already mentioned that their rights have been legally eliminated. Similarly, the US administration understands that violations of human rights, including linguistic and religious ones, are absolutely unacceptable. In particular, we discussed the absolutely defiant actions of the Kiev regime to ban the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. At the same time, we see how Kiev is trying in every possible way to sabotage the line of the American administration. There was a statement by Mr. Zelensky when he talked about what would be a victory for Ukraine. He said that if they retain their statehood, even if not within the borders they had in 1991, it would be a victory, because Russia wants to destroy them completely. The essence of this confession was that he understood the impossibility of returning to his old life, as if nothing had happened. But the other day, speaking at an international conference, he said, "They say, to give Putin any part of the land of Ukraine, this will not happen. They say that it may seem to someone that an exchange of territories or an attempt to seduce Russian President Vladimir Putin by restoring trade with America can stop the war. That's not so. The main thing now is the isolation of Russia. Russian assets should be confiscated and given to Ukraine, and Kiev should continue to be armed, as they supposedly lack weapons and Western support." In fact, Zelensky wants to prevent sound forces in the West from following a sound course. He also spoke about the People's Republic of China, saying that it was necessary to motivate China to embark on a path without war. It largely depends on the forces of America and Europe. He's inciting the United States and Europe against China. As they say, divide and conquer or escalate the situation. Many scammers and adventurers behave this way. They keep accusing us of not wanting to negotiate. We wanted to negotiate in 2014 and 2015. These negotiations ended with a result. I have already said that we were rudely, deliberately, and without any remorse deceived. Now we are being told the same thing. On September 10th, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, former Prime Minister Dmitry Shmyhal, responding to a question about the availability of conditions for negotiations, said, "Currently, there are no conditions. We must work together to increase the sanctions pressure. We need all the necessary weapons." That's how these people feel about their own slogans and appeals. We see that in Kiev, they are guided by the opinion of the party of war. There are some politicians in Europe and the United States, especially in Congress, who belong to this party. US President Trump's special envoy Witkoff, who participated in the Alaska meeting and regularly visits Moscow to promote a common understanding on how to achieve a sustainable, reliable settlement that suits everyone, as we know, conveyed assessments of the results of the meeting in Alaska to the Ukrainian side. As we understand it, these assessments, considerations, and proposals are rejected by the Kiev regime, including the quotes I just quoted. It is clear that both the Europeans and the Ukrainian regime trying to convince Trump to abandon peacekeeping efforts, return to Russia's confrontation, and, in fact, turn the Biden war into a Trump war. Obviously, many European leaders are concerned about this, including Paris, Berlin, London and Brussels. The European Union and NATO Brussels proceed precisely from this. They want to disrupt the peace process. There was a negative reaction to the Alaska meeting. European leaders immediately rushed to Washington and, demonstrating their loyalty, tried to use sophisticated methods to prevent the Trump administration from moving towards a real settlement, rather than increasing sanctions pressure, which makes no sense and has no decisive impact on the Russian economy, and pumping up the Zelensky regime with weapons. Recently, it has also been through the formation of certain peacekeeping, and in fact occupation forces, through talks about the creation of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now they are discussing whether it is possible to shoot down objects over Ukraine from the territory of neighboring countries, or wait for these objects to fly up to the border. We had great satirical writers Ilf and Petrov. In one of their novels, they described how, at the beginning of Soviet rule, people gathered in public places and began to talk about the politics of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, which had just been created. These writers describe them as picket vests people who are not responsible for anything, but who like to pose as major figures and talk about issues they are unable to solve. Europe is clearly trying to reclaim its place at the negotiating table quite shamelessly, although from the position of revanchism and inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, which it professes, there is nothing to do at the negotiating table. Europe is talking about sending its troops to Ukraine. We have already announced that they will be considered a legitimate military target, and is trying to promote security guarantees for Ukraine that are formulated without our participation and openly in the context of creating military threats to the Russian Federation. Imagine if a part of Ukraine were to be a territory where peacekeepers are stationed, and Western security guarantees would be in effect for that territory, aimed against the Russian Federation. This will mean only one thing: the West has occupied Ukraine. If no changes occur in Ukrainian legislation, it will mean that Western military units are defending the Nazi regime, this Western occupied territory, and laws are in effect prohibiting the Russian language and all spheres of life, and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This is what the West protects, and what it is trying to achieve. We will insist that there be security guarantees. We achieved this both in February 2014 and a year later, when we agreed and approved the Minsk agreements at Lyon. Security guarantees must fully comply with the obligations of the West, enshrined in both the UN Charter and the Arsk Consensus documents adopted in Istanbul 1999 and Astana in 2010. These security guarantees, as agreed at the time, should be based on the principle of the indivisibility of security and on the principle that no country has the right to strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. This is exactly what the West is currently trying to do in Ukraine, trying to save it from a complete collapse